I want to start by asking you to describe the last time you saw Olgivanna in this room.
Well, the last time I saw her was the day of her memorial in this room. Before that, I really don't remember. I mean, I was much more likely to see Mrs. Wright in the Swan Cove or in the living quarters than in here. So it's difficult for me to answer that question. Mm-hmm. Quite often, Mrs. Wright would call me, and I would go and work with Mrs. Wright for an hour or so in the Swan Cove, discussing problems and the solution to the problem and what we were going to do about it and plans for the future and so on.
Taking the last 10 years of her life, what would you say were the problems that most preoccupied her?
Well, I think one of the problems Mrs. Wright was quite concerned about is how was Taliesin going to move into the future. As we moved toward that, Mrs. Wright very often consulted with many people. I mean, she was a person who wanted to talk to everybody and really gather as much information as she could before she made a final decision about something. One of the people who was a great deal of a person that Mrs. Wright asked quite often questions of that sort would be Orm Lewis, our attorney. Orm Lewis was Mr. Wright's attorney, that he became the foundation attorney, and he almost became a member of Taliesin. I mean, he was extremely concerned about moving Taliesin into the future. It was his suggestion that we needed to become an accredited school. And so Mrs. Wright was very concerned about becoming accredited. And I would say about 1980, a man whose name at the moment I can't remember, but he was the dean of the School of Architecture at the University of New Mexico. And at that particular moment when he visited here, he was president of the National Architectural Accrediting Board. And he came and spent the weekend and talked to Mrs. Wright a great deal, and he felt that we were ready for accreditation immediately. So he simply said, all you have to do is apply and you'll become accredited. So we started in that direction, and I would say about 3 or 4 months after that, the NAAB had their annual board meeting in Scottsdale, and we invited the entire board out, and they came out to look at Taliesin. After they'd been here, they asked if 3 of us could come down and have breakfast with them the next morning at their hotel. I was one of the people. I think that it was Tom and Charles, but the other 2, I'm not quite sure. It might have been John R. At any rate, we went down, and they had a great deal of difficulty saying what they had to say, but they didn't feel that we were ready for accreditation immediately. They suggested, first of all, before we could become accredited professionally, which is what the NAAB does, we had to become accredited as a school. And so we said, fine, we'd become accredited as a school, and then they felt we had to do quite a few more formal things than we were doing. By way of that, actually, I would say starting in the mid-60s, Mrs. Wright began to ask and suggest that we have supplemental classes. When Mr. Wright was alive and after Mr. Wright died, when Mrs. Wright very often would talk to the fellowship, on Sunday morning Mr. Wright would talk, as you know, because you were here, about many interesting topics. Mrs. Wright continued that custom after Mr. Wright died. And to a certain extent, that took the place of what are normally called liberal arts courses, because those talks could be about anything, and they'd be very stimulating, and they would get your mind working. When Mrs. Wright and Mr. Wright no longer here, and Mrs. Wright began to get involved in other things and didn't want to continue that, she felt that we should start having classes. So we started having classes. John R. started a class, for instance, in just the business side of architecture and basic mechanics of how you draw and so on. Bruce started a class in the history of architecture, which was about a 3-year course. Bruce is very knowledgeable not only about the history of architecture but about the history of the world. So he would intertwine the history of the world with the history of architecture. probably much more comprehensively than almost any teacher in the world could do. Tom taught engineering. We began to, so we were already doing some of the things that the NAAB suggested that we do. But when they said we had to become accredited as a school, that seems like something that would be very simple. And they said we had to become licensed. We went to Orem Lewis and said, okay, they want us now to become accredited as a school. It took us 1 year to find out how do you become accredited as a school. And eventually, Joe Satin, who was our publisher, told us how we would become accredited as a school. I mean, what organization we should go to. It was the North Central Association. And he said, simply go and talk to the head of the North Central Association and ask. So after discussing it with Mrs. Wright, I called up the head of the North Central Association in Chicago and went up to see him. And he immediately turned me over to someone named Patsy Thrash. At that time, Patsy Thrash was an associate director of the North Central Association. She's now the head of the North Central Association. So she sort of took us under her wing and started us in the whole direction of becoming accredited. And she's still doing that. Actually, tonight, she's going to be here having a dinner with some of the people from around the country in colleges who help her. I think they're called commissioners of the North Central Association. And I've been invited to dinner, and Tom and Effie are invited to dinner there. I think that I'm going to send my regrets. I'm going to tell them I'm already on my way to Milan, because I just simply don't think I can get there without. But that was one of Mrs. Wright's concerns.
So apart from this, what turned out to be a kind of a titanic struggle to achieve accreditation, what would you say was how would you describe your role in the running of Taliesin after Frank Lloyd Wright's death?
Well, very soon after Mr. Wright died, Gene Masselink died. I mean, Gene died about two and a half years after Mr. Wright died. I'd always been sort of an aide to Mr. Wright and an assistant to Gene and an assistant to Mrs. Wright. And Mrs. Wright had already talked to me before Gene died about the fact that she felt I should be on the board. When Gene died, she simply insisted that I become the treasurer. There were other people who didn't understand why she wanted me to be the treasurer, when there were many people who had been here far longer than I had been. But Mrs. Wright insisted that I was to become the treasurer. So I became a member of the board and the treasurer. Mrs. Wright was the president, and Wes was the vice president. And John Hill, at that time, agreed that he would become the secretary, and he would come back, but he could not come back for over a year after Gene died. So from that time on, I became the treasurer and began to handle the business of the foundation. And in that role, I became what I would say Mrs. Wright's executive assistant. I mean, Mrs. Wright would call me in, and we would discuss something, and she would call other people in, and then she would reach a decision. Usually, she would get the board in, which would be, at that time, would be composed of Wes, Mrs. Wright, and me. Then when Johnny came, he was added to it. Eventually, Yvonne was added to it, other members, and we've gradually grown to now, we have a 12-member board. But once the decision was reached, then quite often it was up to me to implement it. I mean, especially if it was something to do outside of Taliesin, and sometimes inside Taliesin.
So quickly, your responsibilities became not just financial, but executive.
That's right, yeah.
Can you describe, for one thing, did you have that much experience in financial administration at the time you became treasurer?
In my entire life, everything that I've done, I never had any experience in it before I got there. I mean, no matter what I was aiming for, I went in the other direction. However, I had from the time that I came to Taliesin a very strong relationship with Mrs. Wright and with Mr. Wright both. Mrs. Wright felt that, and Mr. Wright I think too, that when I said something, if Mrs. Wright asked me a question, I would give her exactly the correct, the truthful answer. I mean, I think Mrs. Wright was the only person in the world that I would tell the truth to totally. I mean, I always told the truth to myself. I never necessarily, I don't think you ever become totally honest with your parents. I mean, nobody in the world wants to be honest with anyone. But with Mrs. Wright, I had total trust in her, and I could be totally honest with her, and with Mr. Wright the same way. But somehow, because Mrs. Wright was the sort of the equivalent to the mother, I became more that way. And to the point that the relationship that developed between Mrs. Wright and myself was that if I brought something to Mrs. Wright and said that should be signed, Mrs. Wright did not even question it. She instantly said, "Fine, I'll do that."
But there was a maternal, there was a mother-son quality to your relationship?
Well, there was a mother-son quality, but it was much more than just a mother-son quality. I mean, I was much closer to Mrs. Wright than I was ever close to my mother. But I think it was also a teacher-pupil relationship, and it was a relationship of a trusted, I don't want to use the word employee, I would say a trusted co-worker. So it was a cooperative relationship, always with Mrs. Wright being the one who made final decisions, but then I would be there to help carry them out. And if Mrs. Wright suggested we do something, I would try to find a way of doing it.
On your side, was this trust immediate that you felt in her, or did it develop gradually?
I would say it developed in the first 6 months I was at Taliesin. Several things happened which I don't really want to talk about that developed a close relationship between both me and Mrs. Wright, and Mr. Wright also.
So that although you don't want to talk about these things, there are things. This is not just a mystical,
no,
immediate bonding.
No, I'm not talking in any way about anything mystical. I'm talking about the fabric of life. What an incident happened. I had to go and talk to Mr. and Mrs. Wright. I told them exactly what my involvement was, which to a certain extent discredited me. They accepted it fine, and as long as I told them the truth, and I think that was Mrs. Wright's feeling about everybody. I mean, I think that any student that Mrs. Wright felt was lying to her was usually asked to leave Taliesin, but I think she had a stronger feeling that, a very strong feeling between the two of us, that whatever I said, she could feel that I was 100% truthful about it.
And this on the basis of you having made yourself vulnerable to her
that's
early
right.
on.
That's correct, yeah.
Because you could possibly have gotten in trouble for telling
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, to the point that I felt maybe I shouldn't be at Taliesin, I went and said that to Mr. and Mrs. Wright. And because I said it to them, in the way that I said it, they said not only should I be here, but they were very appreciative of the fact that I would come and say what I did to them.
You mentioned before, Dick, that whatever you set out to do, it turned out to work out quite differently. That resonates well with my own life. So I'm interested in that. Can you describe that phenomenon in your career?
Okay, my career really started when I came to Taliesin, but in my life before Taliesin, I went to college with the idea that I was going to be a pre-med student. Instead of that, the war came along, and the first thing I knew, I was in the middle of the Army. The Army sent me to ASTP, which was the Army Specialized Training Program, which meant they took a lot of people with a high IQ and sent them back to college. And they sent us back to college to train us to be engineers. After about a year, that ASTP program got to be a sort of a scandal. They were saying, here you've sent all these people, and they don't have to go to the front lines, and they're all everybody else is out fighting, and these people are back in college. So in the way that the Army and the government usually do things, they not only totally disbanded the program, but they sent all the people in it to the infantry. So here I'd been trained to be in the infantry, I mean an engineer, and then I was sent to the infantry. Then I had a very unusual experience. Eventually I was sent as a replacement to Europe, and I ended up on the front lines in the 3rd Armored Division. I was in the 36th Armored Infantry Regiment of that division, which meant that I was fighting on the front lines, and our job was to ride around on tanks to protect the tank in battle, which makes you feel. At any rate, that was sort of the life that I was thrown into after I'd been trained to be an engineer. On Christmas morning, 1944, right in the middle of the Battle of the Bulge, after I'd had a very hair-raising night of digging foxholes and so on, and I'd just been sent into a company where I didn't know anyone at all, It was a brilliant, sunshiny day, and the temperature was about 28 degrees, and the ground was frozen. There was frost all over the ground. It was a beautiful Christmas morning, but it was right in the middle of a battle. The company commander came around saying, who is Private Carney? And I said, I'm Private Carney. He said, would you like to go to West Point? And I said, yes, I would like to go to West Point. He said, well, I have a telegram from Eisenhower saying that you have received a principal appointment to West Point from your congressman, and that you're to be immediately removed from the front lines and sent to division rear to a safe area pending medical exam to go to West Point. So that sounded like a very nice Christmas present. I went to the division rear, which in the 3rd Armored Division meant that you were keeping up with the front lines of the 3rd Armored Division, which were using pincher movements like Hitler. They would take a highway, and everything in the middle was still in enemy hands. And so division rear in the 3rd Armored Division was usually far ahead of the American infantry, right? But that was the safest they could get me. At any rate, I hitchhiked all over Europe looking for a place to get a physical exam. I ended up in Liège, Belgium. And this was at a time when later on it was became knowledgeable that the Germans were dropping behind the American lines people in American uniform who spoke perfect English and to be saboteurs. And of course here I was wandering around, quite a stupid, naive 19-year-old with a rifle over my shoulder and hadn't had a bath in several months, whiskers on my face. And why they didn't pick me up and shoot me, as I think the reason they didn't shoot me was because I was so ignorant. They would say, who won the World Series last year? I hadn't the biggest idea who won the World Series. I'm sure they thought any German would know that, so I must be an American. I ended up in Liège, Belgium, because there was a general hospital there, which was in a tent outside Belgium, outside Liège, walking down the streets of Liège, which at that point was quite a distance behind the front lines, and it was sort of a fairly modern city with life going on as it should. I had my rifle over my shoulder, and the MPs picked me up and asked me what in the world I was doing. And so I explained my story, which was pretty far-fetched, but I pulled out the telegram and they read it, so they believed me. They said as long as I was in Liège, I would have to check my rifle at the MP station. At any rate, when that was all over, and after my medical was finished, I had to stay in the safe area. So I was put in charge of Army personnel, the personnel records. I was to help the regimental sergeant major, because theoretically I was supposed to be in a safe area. And I mean, all of this, none of this that I'd ever been trained for. And I think one of the things that impressed Mrs. Wright the most about this was, I told her once we were someplace in Belgium, it was time to make the payroll, and everybody would be paid in Belgium money. And quite often you couldn't find the people you were supposed to pay, so their pay would accumulate over a long period of time. And I think we had something like $1 million in Belgian money that we were counting out to see if we could go and pay people. It became lunchtime, so we filled the safe in this restaurant that we were using as our office. We couldn't get it all in the safe, so we piled the rest of it on top. It didn't look like money. I mean, it was Belgian money. Went to lunch. But at any rate, that was my first training with using anything to do with finance. But Mrs. Wright felt that then, as soon as the war was over, all the people with high points were sent home. And I was there, and I'd been working with a personnel sergeant major, so he had enough points to go home, so he went home, and the next day I skipped from private up to a tech sergeant and became the personnel sergeant major in charge of everything that he'd been in charge of. And I think that impressed Mrs. Wright quite a little bit. She thought if about the age of 20, that could be imposed on me by the Army, that probably I could do that sort of thing for Taliesin.
Right.
So.
But he either says something about you or about the Army. We're not sure.
Yeah, I don't know what.
But what about your physical? Did you pass the physical, and did you go to West Point?
This all started on Christmas Day. About the middle of February, a message came that I was to go to General Hospital again and have a plaster cast made of my mouth and send it to the Surgeon General. So I went and had a plaster cast made of my mouth and sent it to the Surgeon General. Then I didn't hear anything more. Finally, along in May, when about the time the war was just about over, I wrote to my congressman saying I couldn't understand. Here I had been waiting to hear, and so he got something stirred up, and I was notified that my teeth were so crooked, I had malocclusion severe, that I did not pass the physical to enter West Point. If I were in the United States, they might consider waiving that requirement, but since I was in Europe, they wouldn't do that. But then the war was over, and so I'd had this very interesting experience riding around on top of a 2.5-ton truck with all of our office equipment, setting up an office every other day and working and packing the office equipment away and riding another 300 miles and finding an office to set up in. And so I didn't go to West Point and came to Taliesin instead.
Did you, you didn't consider re-enlistment given the richness of the experience you'd had in the last previous 2 years?
Yeah, no, I'm afraid I didn't.
Okay, so then what brought you from Liège to Taliesin?
Well, when I went home, I decided that I wanted to be an architect, and I decided that actually while I was in the Army. A close friend of mine who was a professor at the school where I went had suggested that I ought to think about being an architect. So I applied to several schools, and I went to Washington U in St. Louis, I lived in Missouri. And I was there 2 years, and I got quite disillusioned with the architecture that was being taught there. And I happened to meet Bill Bernuti, who was one of the charter apprentices at Taliesin. And when I saw his architecture, he really was very much influenced by Taliesin. His architecture was very much based on a look of Frank Lloyd Wright, and he did it quite well. And he had written a magazine article, which he gave me to read, about the building of the drafting room in Wisconsin, saying, you know, that they didn't have any money, so they went out and chopped down trees and took them to a sawmill and sawed the trees up into lumber, quarried limestone, burned it for lime, for plaster. And just reading that, I felt that's the way to learn architecture, not the way that I'm being taught in this school. And he said, why don't you just call up Mr. Wright and ask for an interview? So I wrote to Gene and asked for an interview and didn't hear for a long time. Bill said, well, I think you should just call and say you're coming. So I called and said I was coming, and ended up in Spring Green in the middle of the night and stayed at the Myers Hotel and went out to see Mr. Wright the next day. And we had a discussion, and he asked me what I'd been doing, and I said I was in the Army and so on. And he said, well, if you were in the Army, you probably have a slave mentality. And I got mad and said I did not have a slave mentality, that I was a volunteer, and that I had no slave mentality. And the madder I got, then Mr. Wright said, fine, you can come to Taliesin. So.
Can you describe what, you know, driving up to Taliesin, or however you got there for the first time, what did the buildings look like to you? What did Wright look like to you? I arrived in Spring Green in the middle of the night on the train and spent the night in the hotel. When I called Gene, he sent someone in for me, and I really don't remember too much about Taliesin from seeing it outside. What I really remember is walking up the stairway toward the office from the lower court, and my impression that there was a tremendous amount of stone there, and I felt a little bit overwhelmed by the stone. And then I went up into the office and sat there for a while, and again I found the whole thing a little bit overwhelming. Then Gene told me that Mr. Wright wouldn't be able to see me for a while, so I went out and sat in the tea circle and began to absorb Taliesin. I think it took me several years to really absorb Taliesin and get an impression of Taliesin. I think that I'm still absorbing it. So to say what my first impression is, it's something that has been so built on that I just don't know how I can say. I mean, I think tomorrow my impression is even going to change more. I mean, it's something that's constantly building inside me. Dick, was Taliesin the first Frank Lloyd Wright building you had ever laid eyes on?
That's right. I'd never seen any of his work at all. I'd seen Billy Benuti's office and one or two of the buildings that he had designed, which are extremely Frank Lloyd Wright buildings. I mean, he was very much influenced by Frank Lloyd Wright, and some of his early buildings really looked like Frank Lloyd Wright buildings.
But in your 2 years at the University of Washington?
Washington University, yeah.
You had not seen pictures, or you had seen pictures of Wright's work?
Well, I might have seen some pictures of his work. There's a Mendelssohn church, synagogue near Washington U. I simply don't remember having an impression of the look of organic architecture, and I think the thing that attracted me was not the look of the architecture. It was the philosophy of the school which attracted me. I mean, I think that's what is. Taliesin has organic education as well as organic architecture, and I think it was the organic philosophy of Taliesin that is what brought me to Taliesin.
Do you think your experience in the Army made you impatient with the kind of academic experience that college turned out to be? You had not gone to the university apart from when the Army sent you.
No.
You had gone for, what, 6 months, a year?
No, I'd had, before I went to Washington U, before I went into the Army, I'd finished my sophomore year in college. And then in the Army, I went to University of Missouri for a whole winter. And then I came back and took another semester in the college where I had been before. So I was academically, I think that my father was a minister, and I remember I had a Sunday school teacher who I was always very impressed by. And when I was about 12 years old, in the Sunday school class, she was talking about something she had read the night before, which was that I resolved that I will never cheat at solitaire. And that was a very impressive thing to me. And I think to a certain extent that's what attracted me to Mrs. Wright, and I think that's what attracted me to Mr. Wright. And I think that you can lie to everybody else in the world, but you can never lie to yourself. And I thought what was going on in the School of Architecture at Washington U was totally lying to yourself, totally superficial. I mean, there was nothing there that had any substance to it. The first year that I was there, one of the professors had designed a building on the campus, and he had this terrific idea of covering the ceiling with egg crates, and that was absolutely the most exciting thing that happened that year. Everybody thought, the texture of that ceiling is just absolutely tremendous. And somehow the fact that the ceiling had been covered with egg crates left me a little bit cold, and I felt that everything there had no inner substance. And that's what really attracted me to Taliesin, was the inner substance of Taliesin and the inner substance of the buildings.
Was another thing that attracted you to Taliesin the notion that you just did things, whether you had the resources or not, that if you wanted to do something, that you got up and you used your hands and your wits to somehow turn some material, no matter how inexpensive or unpromising, into the shape that would make what you wanted to see? Is that sort of hands-on aspect of Taliesin, was that appealing to you? It
was a hands-on aspect. I don't think that what you're saying right now, I don't think I read that into Bill Bernuti so much as what you're saying now came to me later. I mean, I think that at Taliesin, I learned what you're talking about now. I think that is one of the most important things that happens at Taliesin, and I certainly think that in association with both Mr. and Mrs. Wright, especially Mr. Wright, was that if you decide to do something, make it happen, no matter the resources you can find, and you can get the resources and make it happen, and never turn back. Just keep going toward your goal, and the materials to do it, or the wherewithal to do it, will show up. And I think that was a very, very important element of Taliesin. So I probably read that into what you're saying, but I certainly didn't think about it until I think about it now, because I think that's one of the things that's most important to me at Taliesin. And because we were so hand-to-mouth when I first came to Taliesin, we've gotten away from that a little bit. To a certain extent, Taliesin West now is in the middle of a city. When I first came here, and when you were here, we went out to the washes and got sand and brought it back, and we went up on the hill and got stone, and all we had to buy was a little cement to hold the whole thing together. Now we have to buy the sand, and we have to buy the cement, and we've run out of stone. So, I mean, it's not that pioneer thing that was going on to begin with, but I felt that was a very important part of the. I don't think you teach at Taliesin. I mean, Taliesin sets up an experience, and the experience makes something happen inside you. And I think that, so I would like to say that's a very important part of the Taliesin experience. I think that's the difference between education at Taliesin and education in a university. A university applies education to you. At Taliesin, you really are never taught anything. You're put into a circumstance where by the experience that goes on and the whole way that the experience happens creates something inside you that you'll never lose, and it teaches you something.
Well, that's something that interests me, because in a way it seems like the struggle for accreditation as a school necessarily almost kind of undermines that spirit.
No.
If not, why not?
Okay, because what we're doing is the basic idea of Taliesin is an apprenticeship, an experiential school. We're formalizing things a little bit, but we're not doing what you're saying. We are, when a student comes here, and I talk to the student about what's going to happen here, saying, you're coming to Taliesin, you're going to become a part of a community. You're going to be apprenticed to the community at Taliesin. You're going to be apprenticed to the architects in the drafting room on an architectural experience. You're going to be apprenticed to construction. And especially in the community itself, you're going to be involved in what makes life happen. You're going to have to accept responsibility in the community for the entire community. I have total responsibility for the community. You coming here have to assume total responsibility. You can do it on your level, I'll do it on my level. Whatever you do at Taliesin, if we sell what you do here, the money goes into the community to keep the community supported. If you go out and work in the garden, by working in the garden, you fix it so we don't have to sell, we don't have to pay money to have the garden fixed. So, and all of that is making you learn a responsibility and become a mature adult.
So the apprentice concept has not been weakened by the
Not at all.
existence of classes.
Not at
which
all.
is what the state wants to
No,
see.
and the classes are not done in the way that a university does them. We have glows, and by a glow, that's a group learning opportunity. We will ask someone, there's someone here right now named Roger Majeski. Roger heard about Taliesin and said he would like to come and see if he couldn't get involved in Taliesin, and he had things that he felt he had learned in life that maybe he could help here with. And that's exactly what he's doing. Taliesin, when it was first built, was built as really an architectural lab. Roger has things that can be done as an architectural lab. He has an idea that I happened to come to one of his lectures to the students last year, and he said that the English were getting beef from Australia all during the 19th century in refrigerated ships. And that was a type of refrigeration that was totally dependent on water. And it had nothing to do with modern refrigeration, but the ships were refrigerated. He is seeing if he can revive that system and use it here on our reading room right now. He wants to come and work with the students and do that. So that's going to be an experiment in refrigeration. At the same time, I think we now need to get it to be very much experimenting with solar energy. So if there's nobody here that knows about solar energy, we'll have somebody come, give a glow, get involved with the students in actually making solar energy happen. Bill Moss, who's a national expert in buildings, textile buildings, comes and works with our students, working with textile, putting the textile into tension. If you go out behind the pavilion, you'll see something one of our students did using. So it's not in any way like a university what we're doing with these glows, but we're making a concentrated effort to pass something on to a student in something a little bit like a class, but it's still in the original intention of Mr. and Mrs. Wright. However,
and the teacher, rather than being a pure teacher, is also getting something from the fellowship experience, presumably.
That's right. There's some things you have to teach. I mean, you have to teach engineering, you have to teach physics. There's some times when you have to deal with facts, but in general, we do not want to deviate from that whole idea that that Taliesin is based on experience, and that experience is something that happens inside you based on the experience you had. Do you remember that quotation from Whitman that Mr. Wright put on the wall in the theater in Wisconsin? It's I kept reading that for years, and I can't quote it, but it's something about wisdom can't be passed from one person to another person. It's something that has to float up inside you. And I didn't understand what that meant, but I think that the more I think about that, that's exactly what happens at Taliesin, is that nobody here tries to pass on something to somebody. We try to make an experience in which the experience itself is going to internally make somebody realize what they'll come out of that with more knowledge than they went into it.
Let me go back to your first experience of this lab. That first conversation you had with Wright before he started baiting you, were you overwhelmed by him in the same way the buildings were overwhelmed initially?
No, I didn't feel that.
Can you describe his demeanor? How did he enter the room? How did he greet you?
Again, I'm not sure that I can really remember that. Mr. Wright, I think that Gene took me to see Mr. Wright, and Mr. Wright interviewed me in what is his room. It's about half the size it is right now. And we sat there and we talked about many things. And again, a little bit the way I'm talking about the buildings and so on, over the years, my whole feeling about Mr. Wright and about Mrs. Wright has been so internalized, it's hard for me to go back and say, this is the way Mr. Wright was at that moment. I know that some people describe Mr. Wright as, in a way that they feel that he was always acting and that he's always up on a pedestal and so on. I never felt that about Mr. Wright at all. I felt that Mr. Wright was 100% a human being, and that he was not what you would say is an extraordinary human being. He was just exactly what a human being should be. Most people are only about half of what a human being should be. So I felt that about both Mr. and Mrs. Wright, that they've reached exactly what every human being should be, and the rest of us ought to strive for that. It's not that they were superhuman, they were simply human. And in saying that, I mean that it's not only it's everything that goes about making up a human. Mr. Wright could get angry, and he could get mad. He had one of the most beautiful sense of humors I've ever run into in my life. When Mr. Wright would talk to us on Sunday morning, I would feel this intense intellectual energy coming to me. When Mr. Wright finished talking, I'd been so set on fire that I would want to go out and run for about 5 miles just to get the energy out of my system. And Mrs. Wright in the same way. I think that any contact you had with Mr. and Mrs. Wright, and then I was with Mr. Wright so much because Mrs. Wright asked me if I would become Mr. Wright's aide, and so I would drive Mr. Wright, and I would help him get dressed, and I would be with him, run errands for him, and so on. That through the years, I just in dealing with Mr. Wright, I always felt that this humanness. I mean, again, as I said, both to Mr. and Mrs. Wright, I felt much closer than I ever did to my parents, but always on a human level.
On that level, one of the things I remember best about you, because you had come in 47?
48.
Yeah. When I was there in 51, 52, or 53, I think
Yeah.
I knew you primarily as the driver of these wonderful cars
Yeah.
that I lusted for.
Yeah.
I was dying to learn how to drive, and I knew that you drove there were these 2 Lincoln cabriolets
Yeah.
grandfather had personally ordered customized after an accident or something.
Yeah.
Can you tell us something about those cars?
Well,
and your relationship to them?
one of them was one of them belonged to Mrs. Wright and one belonged to Mr. Wright. The one that belonged to Mrs. Wright was just a Lincoln Continental, a two-door Lincoln Continental with and it was just I think those must be the most beautiful cars ever designed, that Lincoln Continental. They were designed in the early 40s, I believe. Mr. Wright's had been, I think his was a convertible, but it had been a wreck and been quite badly damaged. And this was done before I came to Taliesin, but Mr. Wright turned it into a cabriolet. And by cabriolet, the rear seat was covered with metal shaped, it was almost like a dome had been put over the rear seat. Then the front seat was open, and the windshield came up and the windows on each side. And usually you would drive with nothing over that, and that meant wind would circulate through the whole car. But there was
also no rear view. There was no rear window.
No, that's right. And there's a piece of leather you put over the front. But once I took Mr. Wright to downtown Phoenix, and in that car, and I let Mr. Wright out, and he went into the bank, and I tried to park. I tried for about 5 minutes to bike that car up. There was just absolutely no way you could see how to bike. This is parallel parking. Finally, I made a U-turn in Central and drove into an alley and jaywalked across the street. There was a cop standing there who said, "You have committed more traffic offenses in the last 5 minutes than anybody I've ever seen before." He said, "I was so dumbfounded by what you were doing that I had decided I wouldn't give you a ticket unless you happened to walk over here, but since you've come over here, I'll give you a ticket for jaywalking." So, but Mr. Wright was very proud of the car. It was a terrible car to drive. We kept it several years after Mr. Wright died, but it was a very expensive car to keep up. I want to go out of the interview a minute. What are you going to do with this interview? I would like to tell something about that, but it
will go into the archive, and
okay.
You will be in control of it.
Okay. I would say that car was beautiful to be in, and it would certainly impress other people, but to drive it was sheer agony. But you know, Tom Monahan eventually got hold of that car. And Tom Monahan, of course, was trying to collect everything he could possibly do about Frank Lloyd Wright, and he was also trying to appear that he was giving lots of money. He said out of all of his billions of dollars that he would give $25,000 a year to whichever building he thought most needed it and was doing the best job of preservation. I mean, $25,000 is hardly enough to even start thinking about. So he decided he was going to confer for this particular episode $25,000 on Unity Temple in Chicago. And there was going to be a ceremony early in January to do that. So he decided, since he owned the Cabriolet, that he would drive down from Ann Arbor to Chicago in the Cabriolet. And whoever was driving it, I heard a description of it. First of all, you couldn't get the leather to stay on the top. Then the heater broke. And the temperature was about 0 outside. And apparently he stuck it out all the way to Chicago, but I somehow felt he certainly deserved that. I think I couldn't have thought of anybody nicer to have that experience. I'm sure it'd be a little bit like riding on the outside of a 747. You know, it'd be just freezing to death.
That's great. Tell me about the one of the things that struck me most when I came to Taliesin, and what I realized I looked for ever after in college without finding all the many colleges I went to, was this intense communalism. That is, the relationships not so much vertically with Mr. and Mrs. Wright, but the relationships with the other people your age, mostly your sex as well. What was the size of the town you'd grown up in, Missouri?
Well, I'd lived all over Texas. My father was a school teacher and a Baptist minister, and we moved about every 3 months, but about every 3 years. The town that I came from in Missouri when I went away to school was about 2,000 people. And usually I lived in a town of, I think I went to grade school in a town of 10 to 20,000 people, always small towns.
How many brothers and sisters did you have?
I had one sister.
Older?
Younger than me.
So the Army is a kind of communal atmosphere for sure, and college in some ways has that. But was that aspect of Taliesin exciting and shocking until you were in?
Well, when I came to Taliesin, there were an awful lot of veterans here because the GI Bill was just, and I think there were more people at Taliesin at that time than had been in a long time. Actually, since that time, Taliesin has remained at about that size. But there were an awful lot of people just out of the Army, and a lot of them kept in their own minds, I'm sure, comparing Taliesin to the Army. So they would think they were going to be on KP, or they had latrine duty, or something of that sort. And that simply is not what Taliesin's all about. I think that what Taliesin's all about is, Taliesin's an extended family, and the relationship of everybody in it gets to be that of being related, and it's a more powerful relationship than blood, I think. And I guess my father came from a very large family. He had about 10 brothers and sisters, and when all of my family gets together, there are probably 50 people there or something like that. With Taliesin, it's much more than that, but I feel about anybody, I mean, I feel toward you, and toward Eric, you know, that in a way you're one of my relatives. I mean, you're sort of one of my cousins, or my younger brother, or something. It depends a little bit on how much you were involved in that. I've also found that if someone goes away from Taliesin, and they're away 10 years, they come back, they fit in exactly where they used to be. I mean, and they say that too. It's almost as if they've never been away. I mean, everything that happened while they were away sort of drops away. But it definitely is it's a unique experience. It's far more than a community. I mean, it is a community, but it's more of a family. And I think everybody in it feels toward everybody a sense of responsibility. And that's what I was talking about, that when we accept a student, we pass on to them that they have to assume that when they're coming here, they become responsible to the family. But on the other hand, they get a tremendous amount from the family also. And in doing that, I'm not trying to describe a commune. I mean, I think there's something quite different about what happens at Taliesin.
Yeah, I think what I experienced in many ways for the first time in my life was a kind of love.
Yeah.
Love of work and love of the people that I was working
That's right.
with, that I had never experienced
No.
before and have not really experienced since. That this kind of task orientation and the intensity of the task, which also spilled over into for me, into the intensity of the relationships between the people that were doing it. I remember vividly David Wheatley, for instance, who took a kind of mentor interest in me in one of those summers and all of those things. Was there anyone for you at Taliesin who played that role of kind of mentor apart from grandfather and grandmother?
I would say that probably Jean Maslink had that relation. I had that relationship to Jean more than, I mean, I would go and talk to Jean and confide in him, and I would say that he's the one that would fit that description most closely for me. But
and what were the kinds of things that you and Jean talked about? The things that were there problems that you had that Jean was able to help you with, or did you always take your problems directly to Mrs. Wright or Mr. Wright?
Well, it would depend on what kind of a problem it was. If I don't really quite remember the nature of the problem, but the day Jean died, something upsetting had happened to me, and he died Sunday afternoon, and I remember spending about an hour or so right after lunch talking to him about how I felt about somebody. In a way, I've discovered that you can do that at Taliesin. If you find somebody that you can trust, you can go and say, that so-and-so dirty so-and-so did this to me, and so on and so on. You can get rid of all your negative feelings by passing it on to, say, your mentor, so you no longer feel mad at the other person. You can get it out of your system. And I think that's what I was doing with Gene that day. And in turn, he was very upset about something that had happened, and he was giving me his feelings about that. So we both ended up feeling much better because we had unloaded our troubles on one another.
Were there people subsequently to whom you played a kind of mentor role in the fellowship that stand out in your mind?
Well, right now we all take on a role of being an advisor to somebody. Richard Hoffmeister, who's here right now, I have that relationship to. I have it to a certain extent with Tom Payton here. My relationship with Bruce has been, I'm about 10 years older than Bruce. So when we first came, to a certain extent, I was older, but I think as we've gone on, it's become more of a comrade relationship. I mean, we both have major responsibilities, and we share those responsibilities with one another. And so it's not exactly a mentor relationship. I think I have a very strong comrade relationships with quite a few people that I go and share my responsibilities with.
As it has worked out, Dick, your participation in the fellowship turns out to have had less to do with architecture than with the maintaining of the organization itself. Yeah. Can you describe the curve that led to that? That is, was there a point at which you knew you were not going to be a designer of residences or buildings, but you were going to be a designer of the lifestyle that is here? Or did you think of that as a kind of architecture itself that was becoming more interesting to you than formal architecture?
I don't think there was ever a time when I thought that this other was going to happen to me and I would no longer be an architect. I mean, I came to realize that probably in the 60s that I had gone too much in the other direction. I always felt everything I was doing was very important to architecture. I mean, I think my contribution to Taliesin is a very important contribution to architecture in general.
Your 3 o'clock is here.
Okay. All right, I'll be with you in just a few minutes, Dick.
Okay. You were saying that you think your contribution to architecture was very profound on the basis of just what? Tell us.
Okay, well, I think by my work in holding Taliesin together and helping Mrs. Wright hold it together, and makes a major contribution to architecture. I mean, I think Taliesin is very important to architecture. I think that also I'm a person with ideas, and I've had a lot of ideas in architecture that I've passed on to other people. So my main design, the only time I've really ever gotten involved in design has been stage design, which I've done a great deal of through the years with our festivals of music and dance.
Can you, I know this is one of the things that Indra wanted me to ask you about, which I haven't yet, but could you talk just very briefly, because I know you have to go, about the stage design part of your career? How did you first get involved in it?
Well, I think several other people have said that had done something and it hadn't worked, so I said I would like to try. The design that I was doing on the stage went in several different directions, but I think that I began to hit on an idea of how you could do things with lights and shadows. And we did probably the first major thing that I did was, it was more than stage design, but we were, for Christmas, we were going to have quite a bit of dance going on as the entertainment for the Christmas dinner. I took the entire pavilion and I asked if I could do it with Mrs. Wright first, and then I totally lined the pavilion with black plastic. My idea being that guests were all going to sit on the stage, and the audience itself, we took all the seats out, so that became the stage. I wanted it to feel that everybody was floating in space, and that you could not find anything where you could say this is solid. I mean, by floating in black, then I used the little lights all through so that you would see these as stars. And I really had the feeling, especially when you looked at Bike, that went on forever. I mean, you could not find any place where you could say that it stops there. And the dancers then came and they danced on many platforms coming down, and again tried to make those things so you couldn't feel that they were dancing on anything solid too. Then the next year we did something similar to that using scrim, so that again it felt that you were going, and I know that Mrs. Wright said that Clara Luce could hardly believe that we could create that sort of an illusion. She thought you could do it on a Hollywood soundstage, but she couldn't understand how we could do it in the pavilion. Then after that, when we started using the pavilion in the way that normally is with the stage, half of the back of the stage is, there's a gigantic stone mass there, and then the other half is open. And we built a cyclorama behind that. And by putting scrim in front of that, found that we could make all sorts of effects of light and shadow. For instance, I took a plywood, a big sheet of plywood, and I started taking rectangular and square pieces of plywood and fastening them at various lengths from the big piece. And then by and putting them all over this, and some above and some below, so that when you had lights and shadows there, this would almost appear to be a three-dimensional city. And it was, and you couldn't tell where the solid part of the plywood left off and where the shadows of it, and especially if you're using colored light, the shadows are in colors also. So it became very difficult to tell where one thing left off, and you could create all sorts of effects, and then by changing the light, it could become some other effect. I did a stage set once in which Giovanna had created a dance in which scientists came and in experimenting to see what the original thing that was there were insects. I mean, there were butterflies and so on, and they were all happy in nature. The scientists came and trying to figure out what all these insects, flying insects and so on, were. They killed them all. So I made a set behind that, which to begin with looked rather as if it were trees and so on. But as the light changed, it became some very sterile looking things that you would think might be a nuclear power plant or something. And all of that done by changing light on the objects. And I really got fascinated with the idea of how you can do scenery with light and shadows.
And had you ever seen any Broadway productions, or had you seen, what was your previous theatrical viewing experience?
Well, I was in college, I was in plays and so on, but that was totally an idea that developed at Taliesin. After it was all over, I mean, after I started doing that, I once went to Las Vegas for the weekend. This was 20 years ago, and went to all the shows in Las Vegas, because Las Vegas does some real extravaganzas. But that was after I'd started doing this other. One of the sets there was done by Sean Kinney. You know, Sean Kinney was a student at Taliesin. When I think there were 4 or 5 Irish boys who applied to become apprentices here, Mr. Wright said, fine. They took a boat and they sailed across the Atlantic, and eventually got here, pretty hair-raising. And most of them only stayed a month or so. I think Sean Kinney maybe stayed 6 months. But then he became quite a famous stage designer. He died quite young, maybe 10 or 15 years ago. But one of the shows I saw there was his, and it was very interesting.
This is great, Dick. Well, I think
Can I ask one question?
Sure.
Is there one piece or design of Mr. Wright's work that particularly struck you, or that you have a fondness for?
Well, That's very difficult to answer because I think all of them do. But I would think the Guggenheim is certainly very impressive to me.